When I saw my husband flipping through my phone, my heart skipped a beat, not because I feared being caught, but because I knew he would find those messages. The ones I had forgotten to delete. I lunged for the phone, but he pulled it back quickly, his eyes locked on the screen. I watched his face shift as he read line by line, and I felt my life unraveling in real time. Yes, he would discover the truth now. But not the whole truth. His hands trembled as he scrolled further, and I knew, any second now he would reach that message. The one that would ruin everything. Or maybe confuse him even more. My phone suddenly vibrated in his grip, a new notification lighting up the screen. I saw the color drain from his face when he read the sender's name. He froze. Didn't blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, a nervous habit since childhood. My stomach twisted with dread, knowing what I had done. I could hear his breathing accelerate from 2 meters away. This was it. The moment I had feared most. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake. One that changed everything. And now. I don't know what comes next. But let me tell you how it all began. Before I share the secret I fought so hard to bury, tell me in the comments, where are you watching this from? And be honest, have you ever kept a secret that refused to stay hidden? It was a Tuesday morning, dull and muted, the kind that blurs into the week without making an impression. My husband sat at the table reading the newspaper like he always did, wearing that same navy sweater he'd had for years, the one with a small hole in the left sleeve. I'd patched it once, early in our marriage, before I stopped noticing such things. I stirred my tea and watched the steam curl upward. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, it was just silent. Familiar. Predictable. But lately, even predictability began to feel heavy. Like a blanket I no longer needed, still draped over me out of habit. He cleared his throat to say something, then didn't. I glanced up, half hoping for eye contact, for a signal that he still saw me. But he was already back in the news, already elsewhere. I left the house around noon for groceries. The rain had just begun, soft and whispering on my umbrella. It wasn't until I stepped out of the store that I saw him. Leaning casually against the wall by the parking lot, cigarette in hand, eyes narrowed in thought, until they met mine. He smiled, and it took me a full 2 seconds to recognize him. He was older, of course, like we all were, but those features, sharp eyes, easy grin, that careless confidence, hadn't faded. It had been years. We used to spend summer evenings on the same porch, our families tangled together in barbecues and shared laughter. But time pulled us apart, and I hadn't seen him since. "Jessica," he said. That was all. Just my name. But something about the way he said it, it felt like being remembered. We didn't talk long. Just polite catching up. "Where do you live now? What are you doing? How's life?" I lied and said good before I even thought about it. I wasn't sure why. He told me he was staying with his mother a few buildings over. "Just for a while," he added, tapping ash into the rain. I left him with a nod and a wave, but the echo of our meeting followed me all the way home. I set the groceries on the counter, washed my hands, and looked out the window. The rain blurred the view, but I imagined him still standing there, leaning into the gray afternoon like he belonged to it. That evening, I tried to tell my husband about running into him. I even started the sentence. But my husband was already opening the next section of the paper, nodding without really listening. I let the words die. Maybe it wasn't worth mentioning. Later, I pulled out an old photo album. Not because I was feeling nostalgic, I told myself, but because I was cleaning. Sorting. Organizing. That was a lie too. I found a photo of the 4 of us, me, my husband, him, and his girlfriend at the time. I was laughing in the picture. Eyes crinkled, teeth showing. It was a laugh I hadn't heard in a while. The next day was colder. The weather report called it unseasonable, as if the sky had forgotten what month it was. I opened the wardrobe and hesitated. I chose a sweater that fit snugly, one I hadn't worn in over a year. I told myself it was because of the cold. In the afternoon, I ran into him again. This time in the hallway near the mailboxes. He was holding a worn paperback, something from the classics, judging by the cover. He smiled again, that same easy grin, and said, "You still read Austen?" I was surprised he remembered. "I do," I said. "Pride and Prejudice." Over and over. He held up the book. "I just finished this. Thought you might want it." It was an odd gesture. Sweet, in a way. Innocent, perhaps. But when our fingers touched as I took it, something jolted in my spine. Not desire, not yet, but recognition. That subtle thrill of being noticed. Of existing outside your own repetition. I thanked him and left quickly, but the book felt warm in my hands all the way to the door. That night, I read the first few pages with a kind of focus I hadn't felt in years. My husband was in bed already, snoring lightly. I turned off the lamp and lay down beside him, listening to the rain. There was no sin yet. No betrayal. Just thoughts. But sometimes thoughts are louder than actions. The next morning, I opened the curtains slowly, half expecting to see him out there again. I didn't. But I lingered by the window anyway, holding my tea like a question I didn't want answered. Maybe that's where it all started. Not with a decision, but with a pause. A long pause, where something inside me stirred and didn't go back to sleep. The morning after he handed me the book, I found myself walking slower in the hallway, listening, absurdly, for footsteps that didn't belong to my husband. I passed by the mailboxes again, pretending to check for letters I knew weren't there. I told myself it was coincidence. That it didn't mean anything. But something inside me had shifted, and I was very aware of my movements, my appearance, my presence. Later that afternoon, I was preparing lunch when the doorbell rang. My hands were wet from washing vegetables, so I wiped them on a towel, trying to still the small jolt in my chest. I didn't expect him, but a part of me had been waiting for the sound. When I opened the door, he stood there, holding an umbrella in one hand and the book in the other. "You forgot this," he said, though I hadn't. I stared at the book, confused. "I thought I began, but he smiled, stepping back to show the cover. It wasn't the same one. This one was different, poetry, I think. I wasn't sure. "No, this one's better," he said. It was a harmless interaction. A neighbor lending a book. But the rain was falling harder now, and I noticed how the droplets clung to his jacket, making the fabric dark and clingy. I was wearing a thin blouse, too light for the season, and I felt the chill crawl down my arms as water from my hair touched my neck. He didn't step inside. Just stood there, half under the awning, waiting for me to take it. I reached out and our fingers touched again, this time more intentionally. For a second, he didn't let go of the book, and neither did I. We both hesitated. Then, we kissed. There was no build-up, no warning, no whispered word. Just that. We kissed. And it lasted only a moment. Maybe two. Then we both pulled back. He said nothing. Neither did I. I stepped back into the house and closed the door slowly, the handle cold under my palm. My chest rose and fell too quickly. My legs felt unsteady. I walked to the kitchen in a daze, set the book down on the counter, and stared at it as if it might explain what had just happened. It didn't. Of course it didn't. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt judgmental. I sat at the table and folded my hands, but they wouldn't stay still. I couldn't explain what I felt. Not guilt. Not quite. More like a rush of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not love. But electricity. A kind of dangerous vitality. Like standing too close to a fire you know could burn you. That night, I didn't sleep well. I turned from side to side, pulling the blanket higher, lower, higher again. My husband, as usual, slept soundly, his breathing even and rhythmic. At one point, I lay on my back and stared at the ceiling, wondering how things could feel so familiar and so foreign at the same time. In the morning, I made coffee and opened the window despite the rain. The cool air swept through the kitchen and I welcomed it. I needed clarity. I needed the cold. I poured the coffee, but didn't drink it. I just held the cup, letting it warm my hands. The day went by slowly. I tried to read, tried to clean, tried to write a grocery list. Everything felt mechanical. My mind kept returning to that moment at the door. That brief, inexplicable kiss. I checked my phone more often than usual, though I didn't expect a message. None came. My husband came home late from work. He looked tired. I watched him take off his coat, hang it neatly, and sigh as he sank into the armchair. I wondered, not for the first time, if he noticed the changes in me. If he was aware of the way I'd been drifting. He didn't ask about my day. I didn't offer. That night, as I was folding laundry, I found myself holding one of my older blouses, a soft, fitted one I hadn't worn in years. I ran my fingers over the fabric and realized I was thinking of him again. Of how he looked at me. Not the way a man looks at someone he's married to for decades. The way a man looks at a woman he doesn't know yet. A look that asks instead of assumes. The next day, I avoided the hallway. I left the apartment only once, through the back exit. I didn't want to see him. I wasn't ready. I thought about returning the book, about writing a note. But every scenario seemed too dramatic. Too final. Instead, I did nothing. I vacuumed. I washed dishes. I listened to a podcast and didn't register a single word. I watched the window for movement that never came. By the third day, I began to feel foolish. It had been one kiss. One accidental, fleeting moment. He probably didn't even think about it. Probably had forgotten. Probably regretted it. The realization stung more than I expected. Then, in the evening, as I was setting the table, my husband looked up and said, "You seem quiet lately." I almost laughed. Quiet lately? I'd been quiet for years. "I'm just tired," I said, and smiled. A practiced, efficient smile. He nodded and returned to his food. We didn't speak again for the rest of the meal. That night, as I was brushing my teeth, I glanced at myself in the mirror. I looked presentable. Tidy. Controlled. But there was something unfamiliar in my eyes. A kind of waiting. A kind of wondering. Not for anything specific, just for something different than this. I walked to the bedroom and turned off the light. The sheets were cold. My husband shifted, mumbled something in his sleep, then turned his back to me. I stared at the ceiling again, feeling like a guest in my own bed. I wish I could say I felt shame. That I was consumed by remorse. But the truth was far more complicated. I felt alive, in a way I hadn't in years. And terrified. And uncertain. But mostly, I felt like something had started. And I didn't know how, or if, I could stop it. The day after the kiss felt longer than any other day that week. I woke up early, though the alarm hadn't rung yet, and lay there in the quiet dark, staring at the ceiling. My husband's steady breathing beside me was oddly comforting and suffocating at the same time. I could feel the heat of his body under the blanket, familiar, expected. And yet, my own skin felt cold, as if I was occupying someone else's place in the bed. The memory of the kiss hovered above me like fog, not quite shame, not quite desire. Just confusion. I moved carefully so as not to wake him and slipped out of bed. In the kitchen, I stood barefoot on the cold tile floor, letting the chill sink into my feet like punishment. I made coffee, not because I wanted it, but because it gave me something to do. Something routine. Something to hold on to. When the coffee was ready, I stood at the window and watched the street. The morning was still gray, rain-slicked and quiet. The neighbor's dog barked once, then silence returned. I found myself searching the sidewalk, the entrance to his building, the path we might have crossed again. But he wasn't there. And I was almost relieved. Almost. I spent the morning cleaning, moving from room to room with the energy of someone trying to outrun their own thoughts. I washed the windows even though they didn't need it. I reorganized the pantry, took down curtains, and scrubbed the bathroom sink with more force than necessary. I kept moving because stopping meant thinking. And I couldn't afford that yet. By noon, I was exhausted. I sat on the edge of the couch, wiping sweat from my forehead, and realized I hadn't eaten. I forced myself to make a sandwich, but the first bite turned to paper in my mouth. I left it untouched on the plate and returned to the window. The rain had stopped, and a bit of sun broke through the clouds, making the wet pavement glisten. A woman passed by with a stroller. A delivery man parked across the street. Ordinary things. But not him. He was nowhere to be seen. No message. No knock on the door. No second visit. Just silence. That night, my husband brought home a small bouquet of flowers. Not roses, not anything particularly romantic, just something he'd picked up on the way home, like groceries. He placed them on the counter with a shrug. Thought these might cheer up the kitchen. I thanked him and smiled, because it was the polite thing to do. But the gesture didn't land. It felt rehearsed, like he was performing kindness from memory. And maybe I was performing gratitude too. The flowers sat in the sink for an hour before I remembered to find a vase. We had dinner without much talking. He asked about the neighborhood, some small construction project a few blocks over. I nodded, said I hadn't noticed. He talked about work, about someone getting a promotion. I tried to pay attention. But my mind kept drifting. After dinner, he sat down to read while I cleaned the dishes. My hands moved mechanically, scrub, rinse, dry, repeat. The clink of porcelain was the only sound between us. When I finally joined him in the living room, he looked up briefly, smiled, then went back to his book. I sat across from him and folded my arms, suddenly feeling like we were strangers in someone else's house. Later, when he went to bed, I stayed up. I sat in the dark with just the lamp on and reread the first few pages of the poetry book he had given me. Not my husband, him. The neighbor. The man I barely knew and yet couldn't stop thinking about. The words blurred in places. I wasn't reading for meaning. I was reading to stay awake. To delay facing the silence of our bedroom. At some point, I heard a door down the hall open and close. My body reacted before my mind did, that quick thud in the chest, the immediate awareness. I stood up, walked to the peephole, and looked. Nothing. Just an empty hallway and dim lighting. My heart pounded like I'd been caught doing something I shouldn't. But I hadn't done anything, not yet. Not really. Just a kiss. Just a moment. The next morning, I saw him again. In the elevator. I hadn't expected it. I had my grocery bag in one hand, my keys in the other. When the doors opened and I saw him inside, I hesitated just half a second, but it was enough. He noticed. He smiled, small and polite, but his eyes lingered longer than they should have. I stepped in. The doors closed. We stood side by side. Not touching. Not speaking. The elevator hummed downward, slow and steady. I could feel my pulse in my ears. When the elevator stopped at the ground floor, we both stepped out. I turned to the left. He turned to the right. That was it. No words. No glances back. But my face burned, and my hands shook slightly as I unlocked the door to the courtyard gate. The rest of the day passed in fragments. I couldn't concentrate on anything. I started folding laundry, then stopped halfway. I made a list for the store, then lost it. I burned rice for dinner because I forgot to turn the stove off. I was distracted, scattered, hollowed out by something I couldn't explain. That evening, I sat on the bed while my husband showered. I watched the bathroom door, listening to the water run, and tried to picture a version of myself that hadn't kissed someone else. That hadn't stepped across a line, even if only barely. I tried to remember how it felt to be completely his, my husband's. But it was already slipping, like steam against the mirror. Later, we lay in bed, back to back, both pretending to sleep. My eyes stayed open. I stared into the darkness, heart beating too loud in my own ears. I wasn't sure what I wanted. I wasn't sure who I was trying to protect. But I knew something had cracked inside me. And cracks, I'd learned, don't stay small for long. The next few days blurred together in a strange rhythm of silence and distraction. I filled my time with small, deliberate tasks, things that didn't require decisions, things that kept my hands busy and my thoughts half-contained. Organizing drawers, repotting plants, alphabetizing books I hadn't read in years. Every drawer I opened, every surface I wiped, felt like an attempt to cleanse something internal. Something I couldn't name yet. My husband remained unchanged in routine. His habits were predictable: wake early, shower, breakfast while reading news, work, return home, dinner, then television or a book. At night, we lay in bed like two people who'd run out of shared stories long ago. We still spoke, yes, but it was the language of errands and logistics. We still shared a home, but we hadn't shared a moment, an honest, bare moment, in what felt like years. And yet, there was no violence in our distance. No open hostility. Just absence. And it was that gentle, subtle erosion that made it harder to notice when things began to slip. One morning, as I left to take out the trash, I saw him again. He was exiting his building, wearing a gray jacket and carrying a paper bag with groceries. His stride was relaxed, unaffected. I hadn't seen him since the elevator. And in that time, I had allowed myself to imagine his silence as deliberate. Avoidance. Guilt, even. But he greeted me with a simple morning, as though nothing unusual had ever passed between us. I nodded, unsure how to respond. I felt my heart thud once, twice, and then start to calm when I realized he wasn't going to mention anything. He wasn't going to address the kiss. He wasn't going to complicate it. Maybe that's what I had needed, to know it wouldn't follow me. That he wouldn't demand something of me I wasn't ready to give. But later that day, while folding towels in the living room, I found myself unsettled. Not because he hadn't said more, but because part of me wanted him to. I caught myself staring at my reflection in the window glass. It startled me how much older I looked in the daylight. Not old, exactly. Just faded. Like a painting left too long in the sun. I didn't mind my age, I'd never feared it, but I did mind the stillness that had come with it. The sense that life had narrowed to soft edges and familiar roads. That evening, after dinner, I sat across from my husband at the kitchen table. He was reading again. I studied the curve of his brow, the shape of his hands around the book. I tried to remember the last time we had touched meaningfully. Not out of habit or necessity, but out of want. It had been too long. I reached for my glass of water and set it down harder than I meant to. He looked up briefly. "Everything all right?" I nodded. "Just tired." He accepted the answer easily, then returned to his book. I envied how easily he could slide back into comfort. The next day, my phone buzzed as I was setting down groceries on the counter. A message from a friend I hadn't seen in months. "Saw you near the park yesterday. Were you with someone?" I frowned. I hadn't been near the park. Not in days. I typed back quickly, "No, must have been someone else." But the seed of discomfort had already taken root. I hadn't been doing anything wrong, not technically. But still, the idea of being seen, of being watched, even in something innocent, put me on edge. Later that week, I saw him again. This time in the courtyard, watering the small communal garden patch that no one really maintained anymore. I was passing through, carrying mail, not intending to stop. But he looked up. "How's the book?" he asked, casual, light. I hesitated, then said, "I haven't finished it yet." He nodded. "No rush." I started to walk away, but he added, "Nice seeing you." I didn't turn back, but I heard the sincerity in his tone. Not flirtation. Not manipulation. Just warmth. Something I hadn't felt directed at me in too long. Back in the apartment, I sat down with the book and opened it again. This time, I really tried to read it. The words weren't remarkable, but the gesture still held meaning. I thought about how he'd handed it to me, about the moment before we kissed. About the quiet between us, not awkward, but thick with something unspoken. That night, as I climbed into bed, my husband was already asleep. I lay there in the dark, my body motionless, but my mind restless. I remembered the way my heart raced when I saw him. The way my breath caught when he said something kind, without expecting anything in return. I felt guilty for comparing. But the contrast had become impossible to ignore. The following day, I walked to the market again, taking a longer route. Not because I was trying to see him, but because I couldn't not think about it. I passed by the cafe on the corner. I hadn't been inside in months. Not since it changed ownership. But I stood outside for a moment, watching people talk, sip coffee, touch hands across tables. I turned away before I let myself linger too long. Back home, I tried to return to normalcy. I made soup. I swept the hallway. I answered emails. But my thoughts kept returning to a single question I couldn't escape: was I unhappy, or just awake for the first time in years? That night, while drying dishes, my husband approached from behind and placed a hand gently on my back. It startled me. I wasn't used to the touch anymore. "You're quiet lately," he said. I forced a small smile. "Just distracted." He nodded, as if that explained everything. And maybe for him, it did. But as I finished drying the last plate and hung the towel back on the oven handle, I realized something had shifted. I could no longer pretend that what happened hadn't happened. Not to myself. Not to the reflection in the window. Not to the weight in my chest that hadn't left since the elevator. I didn't know where this would lead. I didn't know what I wanted. But I knew one thing for sure: I had crossed something. A boundary, a line, a threshold. And there would be no going back to how things were. Not completely. Not ever. It had been raining for most of the week, a steady, curtain-like drizzle that softened everything outside. The streets glistened, the trees hung heavy with water, and my thoughts matched the weather: gray, slow, and quietly heavy. I stood by the window for a long time that morning, watching the droplets chase one another down the glass, wondering what I was waiting for. Maybe for the rain to stop. Maybe for the silence to lift. When I finally pulled myself away from the window, I moved through the house like a guest in someone else's space. I ran a cloth across the table, not because it was dirty, but because I needed a reason to stand still for a moment. The scent of lemon cleaner filled the room. My husband had already left for work, leaving behind the usual trail, his half-empty coffee mug, a folded newspaper, a breakfast plate rinsed and stacked neatly. I decided to walk to the cafe. It was a decision made without much thought, but one that felt oddly deliberate. I changed into dry clothes, something a little more fitted than usual, and tied my hair back without trying too hard. I told myself it was just for a change of scene. Just to sit somewhere other than my kitchen. But I also knew what I might find, or who. When I reached the cafe, it was nearly empty, with only a couple of students huddled around laptops and a woman reading near the window. I ordered coffee and took a seat in the far corner, facing the street. The rain had thinned to a mist now, barely visible in the morning light. I wasn't there long before I saw him. He passed by slowly, head down, umbrella angled slightly to the side. And then he paused. I watched him glance at the cafe's window, then at the door, and for a moment, I thought he'd keep walking. But he didn't. He stepped inside. When he saw me, he smiled, not the wide, confident grin from before, but something smaller. Almost cautious. I nodded slightly. He came over, his movements unhurried. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, motioning toward the empty chair across from me. I shook my head. "Go ahead." He sat, placing his umbrella gently against the table leg. He didn't speak immediately, and neither did I. The air between us was heavier than before, but not uncomfortable. It felt like something suspended, waiting to fall. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said finally. "Me neither," I replied. We sat in the soft clatter of background noise, the clink of dishes, the whir of a milk frother, distant traffic. For a while, we said nothing more. But it wasn't empty silence. It was thick with everything we weren't saying. Eventually, I asked, "Have you finished the book?" He nodded. "Weeks ago." I smiled faintly. "You didn't mention." "You didn't either." We both understood that wasn't really about the book. There were things neither of us had acknowledged. And maybe that was safer. Maybe safer wasn't the right word. He glanced toward the window, then back at me. "Sometimes I think about that day." My chest tightened, but I kept my expression neutral. "I do too." He didn't press. He didn't lean forward or lower his voice. There was no urgency in him. Just presence. Calm, steady presence. And something about that made it harder, not easier. If he had wanted more, it would have been easier to pull away. But he wanted nothing. Or didn't ask for it. And that left me facing only myself. I looked down at my coffee, now lukewarm. The surface trembled slightly as I exhaled. "We kissed," I said. He nodded. "We did." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a confession. Just a statement. A fact that had been hanging in the air too long. "And what do we do with that?" I asked. He took a moment before answering. "Nothing, unless you want to." I looked up at him, startled by the simplicity of his answer. There was no pressure in his voice, no suggestion. Just truth. He wasn't asking me to choose. He wasn't promising anything either. The rain picked up again outside, tapping softly against the windows. "I should go," I said. He didn't try to stop me. We both stood, and as I passed him, he reached out and gently touched my elbow. It was brief, barely a brush, but enough to make me pause. We kissed. And then I left. The walk home felt different this time. Not heavier, not lighter, just clearer. As though the path I had taken was no longer veiled in uncertainty, but marked now by a decision. A choice made, even if only half-consciously. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel crushed. But I felt the weight of a moment that couldn't be undone. When I got home, the apartment was still. The flowers my husband had brought home earlier in the week were beginning to wilt. I refilled the vase with fresh water, clipped the ends of the stems, and repositioned them. A small act of preservation. That evening, he came home and hung his coat as usual. He kissed my cheek absent-mindedly, and I didn't flinch. I asked about his day. He asked about mine. We made dinner together in companionable quiet. He made a joke about the overcooked rice, and I laughed. It was strange, how easily the world returned to normal, even when nothing was the same. Later that night, as we lay in bed, he rolled toward me and placed his hand gently on my side. I didn't move away. I didn't lean in either. I lay still, eyes open in the dark, wondering how long one could live between truths. He murmured something, half asleep. I didn't catch the words. I closed my eyes and imagined the cafe again, the rain, his eyes across the table. I imagined his hand brushing mine, not possessively, but with permission. I imagined the warmth of the moment we both let happen. I imagined it for a long time before I finally slept. The days that followed blurred into a quiet fog. I went through the motions, waking up, making breakfast, going for short walks, folding clothes, making dinners, but each movement felt disconnected from the last, as though I were stitching together a life that no longer fit me. There was something strange about returning home from the cafe that day. I had expected to feel more guilt, more panic. But I didn't. What I felt was harder to name, a subtle unmooring. Like the center of my life had shifted slightly, and though everything still looked the same, nothing aligned the way it once had. My husband remained his usual self, unaware or unwilling to see anything different in me. He was kind, steady, gentle in his own distant way. But his attentiveness was habitual, not intentional. I could see the familiarity in his gestures, how each movement had been practiced over time. He was not a man who questioned what didn't trouble him directly. And I had spent years making sure he had no reason to worry. But I worried. Not about being caught, not in the obvious sense. I worried about what it meant that I had allowed this to happen, not once, but twice. Not by accident, but by choice. I didn't see him again for several days. I looked, of course. Every time I stepped outside, I found myself scanning the sidewalks, listening for the creak of the elevator, the sound of his voice in the hallway. But there was nothing. One afternoon, as I was coming home from the store, I noticed a woman standing in the corridor near his apartment. She was young, too young to be his sister, too old to be his daughter. She wore a bright scarf and was holding a takeout bag. They laughed about something as she handed it to him. Their interaction was easy, light. I turned away before he saw me, my heart unexpectedly heavy. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly. But something else. Displacement, maybe. That quiet, bitter feeling of not being part of a story you thought was starting to include you. That evening, I made dinner without speaking much. My husband didn't seem to notice. He ate in silence, eyes on the television, nodding occasionally to news he wasn't really absorbing. I washed the dishes slowly, methodically. I stared at my hands as the water ran over them, thinking about how strange it was that something so small could unmake you. A look. A gesture. A shared moment in a cafe. The next morning, I received a message from an old friend. We hadn't spoken in months, maybe longer. Her message was simple: "Are you okay? You've been on my mind lately." I read it 3 times before responding. "I think so." I didn't know if it was the truth. Later that afternoon, I went for a walk with no destination. The sky was clear for the first time in days, and the sunlight felt foreign on my skin. I walked slowly, trying to stretch the minutes. I passed familiar houses, familiar corners, and yet everything felt oddly distant, like a town I used to live in, not one I still belonged to. As I passed the park, I noticed someone sitting on a bench under a tree. At first, I didn't recognize him. He wore a cap, and his posture was hunched slightly, as if he were trying not to be noticed. But then he looked up, and our eyes met. I paused. He gestured for me to join him. I hesitated, then crossed the grass and sat beside him. The air between us was still. "Wasn't sure I'd see you again," he said after a long moment. "I wasn't either," I replied. We didn't talk much after that. We sat in quiet, watching a child chase a pigeon, an older couple walk by hand in hand. The ordinary continued around us while our silence said more than words could have. Before I stood to leave, he looked at me and said, "You don't owe me anything." "I know that." I nodded, unsure what to say. He didn't reach for my hand. He didn't lean in. He just looked at me with a kind of calm understanding that felt more intimate than anything we'd done so far. That night, I lay awake in bed, the weight of his words circling in my mind. "You don't owe me anything." It was a strange relief, but also a disappointment. I didn't know what I wanted from him. But I had hoped, perhaps unfairly, that he wanted something more from me. The following day, my husband asked if I wanted to join him for a walk. It surprised me. He rarely made such offers unless prompted. I agreed. We walked quietly through the neighborhood, past trees just beginning to bloom, and into the small square where the fountain hadn't yet been turned on for spring. He told me about a colleague who was retiring. About an article he'd read. I listened, responding here and there, but my mind felt divided. At one point, he looked at me and said, "You seem different lately." I tensed. "Different how?" He shrugged. "Not in a bad way. Just quieter, maybe. Somewhere else." I didn't answer. I couldn't. When we got home, he touched my arm gently before stepping into the kitchen. "If there's anything I should know, I hope you'll tell me." I nodded, but the words caught in my throat. I didn't know what was fair to say. What counted as betrayal, and what counted as grief. That evening, I opened the poetry book again. I read one line over and over, *, "We leave pieces of ourselves in places we don't remember entering." *. And I knew that was true. I had left a piece of myself in that cafe. On that bench. In the pause between saying yes and saying nothing. And now, I wasn't sure if I'd ever get it back. The power went out just after dusk. I had been sitting in the living room, sipping tea and staring out the window as the daylight faded behind a thick veil of clouds. The rain hadn't come yet, but it was in the air, dense and humid, as though the sky was holding its breath. When the lights flickered once and then disappeared, I sat frozen for a moment, waiting for the hum of the refrigerator or the soft buzz of electricity to return. Nothing came. I got up slowly, feeling my way along the hallway until I reached the kitchen. The dim light from outside wasn't enough to see much, but it was enough to remind me of how quiet the world became without its usual noise. I opened a drawer and fumbled for the small flashlight we kept near the batteries. Nothing. I checked another. Empty. I knew where I could find one. I stood still for a moment, questioning the decision even as I already knew what I would do. I didn't need the flashlight that badly. I could wait. But I didn't want to. Not really. Not that night. I slipped on my shoes, grabbed a cardigan from the back of the chair, and stepped into the hallway. His apartment was only 2 doors down. The corridor was quiet, lit faintly by the emergency lights, casting long shadows that made everything seem more fragile. I knocked once. The door opened almost immediately. He stood there, holding a lit candle in one hand, wearing a plain t-shirt and jeans. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "Power's out," I said, as though that explained everything. He stepped aside without a word and let me in. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee and something warmer, cedar, maybe. A single candle burned on the counter, and another on the coffee table. He had a small flashlight resting on the sideboard. "You can take it," he said. "If that's what you came for." I hesitated, then shook my head. "I don't know what I came for." He nodded, as though he understood. Maybe he did. We stood in silence for a while. I didn't sit. I stayed near the kitchen, my fingers brushing the edge of the counter. The rain finally started, light at first, a whisper on the windows. He didn't move toward me. He didn't speak again. Eventually, I broke the stillness. "Do you think about it?" He didn't ask what I meant. "Yes." The candlelight flickered, stretching our shadows across the floor. I could hear the uneven rhythm of my own breathing. I turned toward the window, trying to gather something, words, resolve, clarity. But none of that came. Instead, I felt something else, surrender. Not to him, not to desire, but to the weight of everything I'd held back for so long. The years of silence. The routines. The moments I convinced myself I was content when I wasn't. The ache of being untouched, unnoticed. I turned back around and looked at him. We spent the night together. When I left in the early morning, the sun was barely cresting the horizon. The sky was a pale, tender gray, and the ground still shimmered with last night's rain. I didn't look back. I didn't have to. Walking down the hallway to my door felt surreal. My hands trembled as I turned the key. Inside, everything was exactly where I'd left it, my tea on the side table, my cardigan over the chair, the dishes from the day before still stacked in the drying rack. The power had returned. The lights hummed gently. The refrigerator buzzed. It was all so normal. And yet, nothing was. I took off my shoes and went to the bedroom. My husband was still asleep, his breathing deep and steady. He didn't stir when I entered. I stood in the doorway, watching him for a long time, wondering how many things we miss simply because we assume they'll always be there. I took a quick shower, changed into fresh clothes, and sat on the edge of the bed. My hands rested in my lap, still, calm, as though they belonged to someone else. That morning passed quietly. My husband woke up, stretched, kissed my forehead as he always did, and asked if I'd slept well. I nodded. He didn't look at me long enough to see the lie. We made breakfast together, talking softly about the power outage, about the storm, about nothing at all. I was careful to measure each gesture, each glance, as if balance could be restored through precision. But balance had been lost. I could feel it in the way I avoided mirrors. In the way I folded the same dish towel twice. In the way my skin still held the memory of someone else's warmth. Later, he suggested we take a drive, out of the city, maybe to the coast. I agreed too quickly, eager to accept anything that might delay the silence between us from becoming a confrontation. The drive was long and pleasant. We listened to music. He pointed out familiar landmarks. I nodded along, offering smiles at the right moments. He reached for my hand once at a red light, and I let him hold it. But it felt like playing a role. Like reciting lines from a script I no longer believed in. When we reached the coast, we walked along the shore. The wind was strong, whipping at my hair and jacket. I stood still, watching the waves rise and fall, over and over, relentless and uncaring. He came up beside me, wrapped an arm around my shoulders, and said, "I'm glad we came." I nodded, unable to speak. In that moment, I realized something painful and honest. I had stepped too far from where I'd once stood. And I could no longer pretend that returning was simply a matter of will. The sun was setting as we drove home, casting long orange streaks across the highway. My husband hummed along to a song on the radio. I looked out the window, quiet, feeling both full and hollow at the same time. And I knew the story I was now living couldn't remain hidden much longer. Something had shifted. A line had been crossed. And sooner or later, it would ask to be answered. The days after the storm passed were quieter than I expected, as if the world itself was giving me space to absorb what I had done. The air felt heavier, not with weather, but with the aftermath. That strange calm when the chaos subsides, but nothing has returned to normal. At first, I thought I could carry on. That I could live with it, tucked away in some hidden place inside me. I had told myself it was a moment, just one, and that it didn't define me. But the problem with moments is they ripple. They bleed into the hours that follow, the conversations you try to have, the ones you avoid. The way you fold clothes. The way you look at your husband and wonder what he would say if he knew. I began to notice small things that hadn't stood out before. The way my husband would linger in the hallway after arriving home, as if listening for something. The way he asked questions that didn't feel like small talk anymore. "Where did you go today?" Or "Did you talk to anyone?" They weren't accusatory. They were casual. But not quite empty. And then there were the details I couldn't control. The unfamiliar scent on a pillow I'd forgotten to change. A shirt left folded the wrong way. A slight delay in answering a question because I had to rewrite the truth in my mind first. One morning, I found him standing by the bathroom door, holding my phone. "It buzzed," he said simply. I reached for it too quickly. He noticed. It was nothing, an ad from a store I barely shopped at, but the moment stretched between us longer than it should have. He handed it over, his eyes on mine a second too long. I tried to smile. He didn't return it. That afternoon, I found him in the living room, holding a book I hadn't seen in weeks. "This yours?" he asked. I nodded. It was lent to me. "From who?" I paused. "Someone in the building." He turned it over in his hands once before setting it down. "Haven't seen you read it." I didn't finish it. He nodded again, but the silence after that felt like a held breath. Something suspended, just waiting for the weight that would make it fall. I went for a walk later that day. I needed air, space, the illusion of control. I walked slowly, passing familiar storefronts and benches. Every face felt like it could be watching me. Every movement felt like it carried too much meaning. When I reached the end of the block, I stopped by a small corner shop. I wasn't hungry, but I went in and bought tea I didn't need. I lingered, as though avoiding going back would somehow keep me safe. Back at home, I found a pair of socks that weren't mine in the laundry basket. My husband must have tossed them in by mistake. They didn't fit. They weren't his size either. I stared at them for far too long before realizing how easily doubt spreads. How easy it is to question everything once trust begins to crack, especially your own. That evening, while putting dishes away, I knocked a glass from the counter. It shattered on the floor, the sound sharp and sudden. My husband rushed in. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I said, crouching to pick up the pieces. He knelt beside me and placed his hand on mine. "You've been somewhere else lately." I didn't answer. He stayed a second longer, then stood and grabbed the broom. We didn't speak again that night. But I didn't sleep either. I lay in bed with my eyes open, my back to him, staring at the wall. I thought about everything I hadn't said. Everything I'd done. And the pieces I kept hiding, not out of fear, but because I didn't know what they would become once spoken aloud. The next morning, the apartment felt colder than usual. I opened a window to let in air, even though the chill ran up my arms. I stood there for a long time, watching people pass below, each of them moving through their day as if their lives hadn't just bent into unfamiliar shapes. I picked up my phone to check messages. None from him. Not since that night. The silence between us had taken root. Not avoidance. Something more final. I deleted our last thread. Not because I was afraid. But because I couldn't stand to look at it anymore. Not the words. Not the timestamp. Not the reminder of the version of me that had allowed it all to happen. Later, I ran into my neighbor in the elevator, the older woman who lived across from us. She smiled at me politely, then said, "I saw your friend again. The tall one. He doesn't seem to be around much lately." I nodded, unsure what to say. "Nice man," she added. "Yes," I said softly. "He is." I got off one floor early. When I got home, my husband was sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through old photo albums. One lay open between his elbows, our wedding pictures. His finger traced the edge of one image, where I was laughing with my eyes closed. "Do you remember this?" he asked, without looking up. Yes. He didn't say anything else. He didn't accuse. He didn't confront. He just kept turning the pages. That night, we had dinner in silence. And the silence said more than any fight could have. The house was unbearably quiet the next morning. Not peaceful. Not calm. But sharp, like the stillness after a dropped glass before the pieces scatter across the floor. My husband had already left by the time I rose, his coffee mug rinsed in the sink, the newspaper folded with clinical precision. I stood in the kitchen for a long time without moving, the refrigerator humming faintly behind me, the weight of the unspoken thick in the air. I tried to distract myself, sorting laundry, reorganizing the linen closet, even scrubbing the grout in the bathroom tiles, but nothing could quiet the noise in my mind. Every movement felt rehearsed, every object I touched carried a weight it hadn't before. I knocked over a bottle of cleaning solution and didn't bother to pick it up. I just stood there, watching the slow trickle of liquid run toward the drain. By afternoon, I couldn't take the house anymore. I grabbed my coat and left, walking with no destination. The streets were familiar, the sidewalks lined with blooming dogwoods and cracked curbs, but I felt like a stranger among them. My legs moved without thought, and I found myself at the park before I realized I'd even turned that way. I sat on the same bench where he and I had once shared a silence so loaded it had spoken more than words ever could. The air was different now, warmer, lighter, but inside me, everything felt colder. I wasn't waiting for him. I wasn't hoping he'd appear. But my eyes scanned the path ahead of me anyway. He never came. Instead, I stayed there for a long time, watching people pass. A father with a stroller. A jogger in a neon shirt. An older woman walking slowly with a cane. They all moved around me, untouched by the weight I carried. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like the only person in the world who knew something had broken. I returned home just as the sky began to dim. The apartment was still empty. I took off my coat, washed my hands, and sat on the edge of the couch. My eyes landed on the book, his book, still resting on the end table where I had left it weeks ago. I hadn't touched it since deleting our messages. But it hadn't left either. Like a witness I hadn't dismissed. I picked it up, ran my fingers across the cover, and opened to a page marked by a folded corner. The line I landed on read, asterisk, some endings begin with silence. Asterisk. I closed the book. That evening, my husband came home later than usual. He didn't greet me immediately. I heard him in the hallway, setting down his keys, removing his shoes. Then the sound of the fridge opening, the clink of a bottle. A long pause. Then footsteps. He entered the living room and looked at me. There was something unfamiliar in his face, not anger, not sadness. Just stillness. Controlled, measured, deliberate stillness. I saw you, he said. I didn't move. I didn't pretend to misunderstand. I didn't ask when or where or what he meant. Because I knew. He sat down in the chair across from me, not leaning back, not relaxing. I didn't want to say anything until I was sure, he continued. But I've been sure for a while now. My throat tightened, but I kept my voice even. How long? Long enough, he said. Long enough to wonder whether I imagined it. Whether it was my fault. Whether I'd done something to push you away. I lowered my eyes, unable to hold his gaze any longer. It wasn't your fault. He nodded once. That doesn't make it easier. We sat in silence, the only sound the soft tick of the clock on the wall. Time seemed to move differently in that moment, slower, heavier. Each second a weight settling deeper into the space between us. Finally, he said, I've been thinking. About everything. About how we got here. And I realized something. I looked up. We stopped seeing each other, he said. Long before you stepped away. I blinked. I never meant to. I know, he interrupted gently. But you did. He stood, walked to the kitchen, and returned with a glass of water. He handed it to me without a word, then sat again. I'm not going to ask you to explain, he said. I don't need the details. But I do need to understand where we are now. I nodded, the words lodged behind a rising wave of emotion I hadn't expected. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Do you want to stay? The question hung there, bare and honest. Not a threat. Not a plea. Just a question. I didn't answer right away. I stared into the glass of water in my hands, watching the tiny ripples shift with my breath. I don't know, I said finally. His shoulders didn't drop. He didn't flinch. He just nodded again, slow and steady. Then maybe we both need time. The next morning, I packed a small bag. Not everything. Just enough. I didn't say goodbye in a dramatic way. There were no tears, no slammed doors. Just a quiet departure. He watched me from the doorway, arms crossed loosely. We didn't embrace. We didn't promise anything. I stepped outside and paused on the landing. The air was cool, fresh. I looked back once, saw him still standing there, and then turned away. I didn't go far. A few blocks over, I checked into a small hotel. I needed space. Not distance. Just space. A room where the silence belonged only to me. Where the choices I had made weren't reflected back at me through the eyes of someone I had hurt. I didn't reach out to him. I didn't reach out to the other man either. I sat by the window of that small room, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, and stared out at a city that didn't know me. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't know myself either. But maybe that was where I had to begin. Not by rebuilding, not yet. But by sitting with what I had broken. And choosing what to do next. The room I had rented was small, tucked away on the third floor of a modest building a few streets from home. The walls were painted a soft gray, the bed neatly made with crisp white linens. There was a desk near the window, and from it I could see the tops of nearby trees swaying gently in the breeze. The quiet was different here. It wasn't the silence of tension or distance, like it had become in my own home. It was neutral. Detached. And I needed that. I stayed inside most of that first day, unsure of what I was supposed to do. I kept expecting some wave of relief or clarity to arrive, but all I felt was stillness. I made tea using the kettle provided, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the wall. My thoughts came and went without resolution, looping through the same questions that had haunted me for weeks. What now? Where does this end? What am I running from? I didn't reach out to anyone. My phone buzzed only once, an automated message from my bank. I didn't answer emails, didn't scroll through anything familiar. I just sat. And when the sun dipped below the windowsill and the room turned to shadow, I remained exactly where I was. That night, I dreamed of nothing. The next morning, I woke before dawn. The world outside was still wrapped in a blue-gray hush. I walked to the window and opened it slightly, letting the cool air touch my skin. I stood there for a long time, listening to nothing in particular. My breath, the wind, distant traffic, none of it urgent. At some point, I picked up a pen and began to write. I didn't plan to. I just opened the small notepad on the desk and let the words come. Not a confession, not a letter, just fragments. Sentences that didn't belong to anyone. Thoughts I hadn't been able to say out loud. I stopped recognizing myself. It didn't begin with the kiss. I wasn't looking for him, but I also wasn't close to being found. I didn't plan to leave, but I couldn't stay. I filled 3 pages before I stopped. I tore them out, folded them once, and placed them under the teacup. I didn't know why. By the afternoon, I ventured outside. The streets looked the same, but I moved through them differently. I didn't avoid familiar corners or slow down near places I might be seen. I just walked. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like I was hiding. I wasn't proud. I wasn't ashamed. I was just moving. I stopped at a small bookstore and browsed without intention. I bought nothing. I left and walked until my legs ached. And when I returned to the room, I sat in the same chair by the window and watched the light shift again, this time toward evening. It was then that I thought of him, not my husband, not the man from down the hall, but myself. The version of me I had been before the pause, before the fracture. I thought about how much I had compromised, not out of malice, but out of slow erosion. A quiet surrender of self, piece by piece, until I had become someone I didn't recognize anymore. I didn't miss the man I had kissed. I didn't miss the life I had left behind either. What I missed was honesty. Not the kind we owe others, but the kind we owe ourselves. The truth of what we need, what we feel, what we want. And the bravery to admit when those things no longer align with the life we've built. The next day, I packed my things. The room had served its purpose. I wasn't healed. I wasn't ready. But I was steady. And I knew I couldn't live indefinitely in a space meant only for pause. I didn't return home immediately. I stopped instead at a small cafe 2 streets over, the kind of place I had walked by 100 times but never entered. I sat by the window and ordered coffee. Black, no sugar. I drank it slowly, letting the heat settle in my chest. I thought about my husband. I imagined him alone in the apartment, maybe reading, maybe not. Maybe waiting. Maybe angry. I didn't know. And I wouldn't know until I returned. But I also thought about the years we had built together, the comfort, the habits, the silent understandings. I thought about what had been lost and what could still be salvaged, not the illusion of what we had, but something more honest. Something stripped down and raw. When I finally stood and walked home, my steps were measured. I wasn't sure what I would find. I wasn't even sure what I would say. But when I unlocked the door and stepped inside, I found him sitting at the table. The same place he always sat. A cup of coffee in front of him. He looked up when I entered. We didn't speak immediately. He didn't ask where I had been. I didn't explain. He gestured toward the chair across from him. I sat. There were no dramatic confessions. No tears. Just two people sitting across from each other with everything unsaid still suspended between them. I left, I said softly. I know. I needed to. I know. He didn't ask for details. He didn't demand clarity. He simply sat there, eyes steady, as if he understood that whatever came next would be decided not by a single conversation, but by the slow rebuilding of trust, or the acceptance that we no longer knew how. We stayed there for a long time. Outside, the rain began again. Not loud. Not heavy. Just enough to blur the edges of the world. And I let it. Because sometimes, clarity doesn't come in sharp lines. Sometimes, it comes in soft rain. In silence. In staying.